श्री वरगणपते पालिसु श्री वरगणपते पालिसु श्री वरगणपते पालिसु कामितवने नीडै स्वामी श्री
सिंध गुजरात मराठा द्राविड़ उत्कल बंगा विंध्य हिमाचल यमुना गंगा उत्कल जलधि तरंगा तब शुभ नामे जागे तब शुभ आशीष मागे गाए तब जय गाथा जन गण मंगल दायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता जय हे जय हे जय हे जय ताड़ी माता की वंदे वंदे।
Dear friends, sisters and brothers, thank you for being here today. Just to revamp our kids what they presented and their views about India, our resources, why we still lag behind China and other already developed countries is leadership. We know the problems, we know the solutions, but we could not execute them all these days. If you take a sick patient, if they have 10 different problems, let's say heart problem, lung problem, and they have a fracture, and they have another ailment. In the politics, we all say, well, every politician is same. What is going to change? So we had that attitude until now. Just let it go, not take the ownership, not take the responsibility when the elections come. That's why the inefficient leaders were there in power for the past 67 years, the post-independence. For the last 10 years of the governance in India is utterly shameful, as you all know. So you can see a patient is going to die. If you look at the patient, how are you going to take care of that sick person? You take care of the most important problem, which is the life-threatening, the first, which could be a heart thing. If you take care of the heart problem, you have time to treat the other problems. So head of the country, which is the Prime Minister, if he's not the right person, the other organs, no matter what he can do, he cannot execute what he wants to do. So far we had that unfortunate situation. The Prime Minister of India, we never had a leader with a vision, passion, and the heart for the country. So now, Narendra Modi, he has shown his credentials in Gujarat, his passion, his hard work. He works 18 hours a day, every single day. He has no agenda for himself or his family. So he brought the Gujarat, he produced the energy, who is selling to other states now, the power, electricity. There are so many examples like that. So now he should not be alone. We should all be there with him to help him to promote India, welfare of India, development of India. And the game is not over, it is now, we're starting now. So we should always be with him, support leaders, not only Narendra Modi, anybody like him. So be with us all together to move forward. Every step counts, every vote counts when the elections come, and every step counts. So we all need to move forward, and thank you. We have a short video presentation about a few minutes, and then we will take a break. Thank you.
इंडिया का सर्वनाश करेंगे। जो इंडिया को स्वतंत्रता मिलते ही जो आवारा इंडिया पे राज करेंगे, नीच लुटेरे देश के नेता बनेंगे, मीठी मीठी बातों से प्रजा को बहला फुसला के राज चलाएंगे, सिर्फ अपने स्वार्थी लक्ष्य को पाने की धुन में और अपनी गंदी राजनीति से इंडिया का सर्वनाश करेंगे। होते होते साधारण नागरिक को भी हवा पानी के दाम चुकाने पड़ेंगे। भारत की आजादी के पहलू पर ब्रिटिश प्राइम मिनिस्टर विंस्टन चर्चिल ने ऐसा ही कहा था या नहीं, ये बात बहस के काबिल है। पर आज अपने भारत देश की दशा बिल्कुल ऐसी ही है। ये एक कड़वा सच है।
लड़ाई के मारे जीते हैं घर भर के देशवासी। कई साल की है ये कहानी, गांव शहर की है ये जुबानी। परेशान है पशेमान है, अंतिम श्वास है आखिरी आस, इंतजार है इंतजार है। कौन करे अभी तलाश, वो है उसकी तलाश। मोदी है सबका विश्वास, करते रहे कहे। देश प्रेम की भावना हर दिल में जगाता, गुजरात राष्ट्र का विकास किया है उनके विधाता। नदी नदी को जोड़कर वहाँ सोना उगाया, पानी के उस धार से प्यास बुझाया। गाँव गाँव में बिजली की चमक है समाई, खेत खेत में हरियाली लहराई। लोह पुरुष को पटेल फिर से बाण नगर से आया है, अपने भारत देश का सर फिर ऊंचा करने आया। कदम कदम पे चलन चलन में भारत को संपूर्ण बनाए, चुना है नवों भारत माने, रविंद्रहीन भारत निर्माता। सुनहरा कल जो आने वाला अब ये जाएगा, अंधेरा अब ये जाने वाला फिर से आएगा। नमो से है भारत की प्रगति, नमो है साधना, तन मन में है यही भावना, कमल को खिलाना। सुनो सुनो तुम मोदी की बातें सयानी, आओ लिखे हम इस मुल्क की कहानी। नमो की हर एक बात हिला दे अभिनीत की बुनियादें, आओ बने हम नमो की शक्ति गिरा दे सब दीवारें। कंधे से कंधा मिला के हमको आगे बढ़ना है, विदेशी उग्रवादियों धर 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 भागना है।
Having today and talk to you, and my request to all of you is, मैं हमारी राष्ट्रभाषा में बात करूँगी। हमारी राष्ट्रभाषा हिंदी है और हमारी जो करेंसी नोट है, इंडिया की करेंसी नोट अगर आप देखेंगे तो 16 डिफरेंट लैंग्वेजेस हैं और उन 16 लैंग्वेजेस में हम बंट चुके हैं। राधा रायकेन से मंदिर मस्जिद गिरजाघर में बांट लिया भगवान को, धरती बांटी अंबर बांटा ना बांट सके इंसान को। हम 16 लैंग्वेज के अंदर सब मिलके एकजुट होके यही प्ले स्कूल में भी सीखे होंगे और काफ़ी लोगों को आज भी याद होगा, भारत मेरा देश है, सभी भारतीय मेरे भाई बहन हैं, जिससे काफ़ी लोगों ने जोक भी बनाया होगा कि आगे वाले को छोड़ के सारे मेरे भाई बहन हैं। और अगर हम ये भी देखें कि श्री कृष्ण भगवान ने भगवत गीता में जो भी बातें कही हैं वही 12 बातें यीशु क्रिस्त ने बाइबल के लिए कही हैं, और वही बातें आगे अगर हम रिसर्च करें तो पता चलेगा कि कलमा बन के कुरान में भी आती हैं, और वही बातें गुरु गोविंद साहब ने जब कही तो सिख संप्रदाय भी खड़ा हो गया। हम चाहे कहीं भी चले जाए, हम चाहे जो भी हो जाए, हमारी देश के जो 465 राज्य सरदार वल्लभ भाई पटेल ने एक करके एक हिंदुस्तान बनाया था, हम आज भी उसके वासी हैं। हम अत्र तत्र सर्वत्र कहीं भी चले जाए दिल से हिंदुस्तानी थे, हिंदुस्तानी है, और आज उन्नत मस्तक करके भी बोल सकते हैं हम हिंदुस्तानी ही रहेंगे। हम एक खून में डीएनए लेकर पैदा हुए हैं जिसका नाम है इंडिया, और इसीलिए कहा जाता है कि जहाँ पे सोने की चिड़िया दिखती है वही मेरा देश है, जहाँ पे सूरज उगता है वही चमचमता मेरा देश है, जहाँ पे गंगा बहती है वो हिमालय मेरे देश में है, और सबसे ज्यादा अगर सागर को देखना है जाइए कन्याकुमारी, वो भी मेरा देश है, चाहे जाइए कश्मीर वो ठंडक मेरा देश है, चाहे जाइए बाली चाहे जाइए पूरी वो जगन्नाथ मेरा देश है, हमारी जो रक्षा करे वो सोमनाथ और रामेश्वरम मेरा देश है। इसीलिए बुलाइए जयदेव को जो गाएंगे जहाँ डाल डाल कर सोने की चिड़िया करती है बसेरा, वो भारत देश है मेरा। थैंक यू।
खुशियों संग लावी खाए
हुआ है कि दोनों कैंडिडेट जो थे वो आज़ादी के बाद पैदा हुए थे। अगर हम 1947 का कैलेंडर देखते हैं तो उसमें जहाँ पर जवाहरलाल नेहरू थे, 2014 के कैलेंडर में वहाँ पे राहुल गांधी थे, राजीव गांधी के पुत्र। अगर जहाँ पे हम सरदार पटेल को देखते हैं तो यहाँ पर नरेंद्र मोदी थे। और मैं आपको ये याद दिला दूँ कि 1947 में जब प्रधानमंत्री चुने जाने वाले थे तब दो कैंडिडेट ही थे, श्री नेहरू और श्री पटेल। और उस वक्त जब पटेल को हटना पड़ा एक छोटी सी रिक्वेस्ट पर, इस बार नरेंद्र मोदी ने आकर वो साबित कर दिया कि देश को एक लौह तत्व वाले इंसान की जरूरत है जो चुंबक की तरह सबको अपनी तरफ खींच कर रखे, एकत्रित कर रखे। और इसीलिए पहली बार आपने ये देखा होगा कि आज तक कैबिनेट में कुर्सियां उड़ती थी, गाली गलौज चलते थे, या फिर पता नहीं क्या क्या चलता था, सारे देश की गंदगी उस जगह पर जाके अपनी एक दुर्गंध छोड़ के आती थी। अब जब नरेंद्र मोदी जी जीते हैं, पार्लियामेंट्री के पैर छूते हुए या धरती की जो धूल है उसको सिर पे लगाने वाला प्राइम मिनिस्टर पहली बार ऐसा भी नहीं देखा। अंदर जाके किसी ने बोला कि आपने यहाँ पर आकर कृपा करी, आपने पहला ऐसा प्राइम मिनिस्टर देखा जिसके आंखों में आंसू आ गए और उसने बोला देश की सेवा, क्या ये कृपा होती है? ये देश की सेवा है और मैं देश के लिए आया हूँ। और ये पहला इलेक्शन था जिसमें सबसे ज्यादा वोटिंग हुई है। दिस वाज अ ट्रेंड सेटिंग इलेक्शन जहां पर हमारे देश का युवा दल जो सबसे ज्यादा कंसिडर किया जाता है पूरी दुनिया में, उसने पहली बार वोट किया। पहली बार ऐसा हुआ कि हमने ये देखा कि लोग सुबह में जाते हैं मतदान करने के लिए क्योंकि लाइन्स नहीं होती है। इस बार लोग दोपहर के भी बाद में गए क्योंकि काफी लाइन्स थी। और इन सब चीजों की जब शुरुआत हो चुकी है तो उसको हम क्या कहेंगे? शुभारंभ कहेंगे कि नहीं कहेंगे?
Us for this event today. So mainly what I'm going to be talking to you about is how there have been a lot of missed opportunities in India's history, especially after independence. Now, most of you know that we started at a disadvantage, especially given that we were a country that comes from a post-colonial background. So when you have a country like the British Empire who exists in your country solely to exploit and use all of your resources, it's very hard to transition after they leave into a country that actually can have a stable and functioning economy. So now we're going to talk about the main obstacles that we've had to face as a nation in the last 70 years and see how we're actually going to be able to overcome those now that there's some new leadership. Can I get the next slide, please? So, I'm not sure if any of you are aware, but basically the main economic model that dominated India post-independence was that of a planned socialist economy. Now, this seemed to make the most sense in that instance. Given the lack of resources that India had at that point, it was necessary that they had to have some sort of foundation in order to develop their economy. Now, if they just left the economy to the devices of all the people who just lived in the country, the mere population, then this isn't actually going to help improve everyone's situation because, obviously, as we all know, after the British left, those citizens of India didn't have the resources they need to live in a strong and prospering country. So, what Nehru did was basically establish an economy that functioned on the idea that we need to plan out which each sector of the economy is going to produce, which is basically the way the Soviet Union and all of these other command and socialist economies function. Now, this sort of economy persisted for about the last 60 or so years, until 1991. In 1991, Narasimha Rao, basically, during his administration, what happened was, if you can also remember, 1991 was the year that the Soviet Union collapsed. Now, the Soviet Union was a huge geographic stabilizer for the country of India because it was so close by. At the same time, it was also a huge trade partner. So at the point where the Soviet Union failed, India was basically entering a crisis in which they no longer had the friends and the economic support that they used to have in that region. So what they had to do now was to liberalize their economy. What that basically means is that they've begun to let go of parts of their economy and deregulate them and remove the government controls on most of these parts of the economy. So now the private industry and the private people can now begin to invest in them and take control. Now, here's the most unique and interesting thing that we're going to find out today, is that the level of growth of the economy and the level of the decrease of the poverty in India same when we had a socialist system. Also it was the same that we had in the system post Narasimha Rao. So the question ultimately arises, if we've had two completely different systems in our country's history, and both of them have given us the same results, are we actually using our resources to the full capability? If we can change the systems and have no net difference, then are we doing the best we can, or are there problems or hindrances in place? Next slide, please. So basically, to discuss some of the key issues that India faced that they had to change post-liberalization of their economy, first you have to consider the way their economy was divided up. So as most of you probably know, agriculture is perhaps one of India's greatest sectors. It's one of the greatest, largest aspects of the economy. Even though that has decreased in the last few years, India is still the second largest exporter and producer of all of these natural agricultural goods. So clearly farming and all of these other sorts of things play a huge deal in terms of India's economy and our basic social and political life. But when you look at how much since it's such a huge part of our economy, our government gives a lot of subsidies to to agriculture to make sure that we can support agriculture and to make sure that everybody is getting the food that they need and all the food that we need to produce to feed everybody is being produced. Now, if you actually look at how this works out, the average farmer in India only makes 10 to 23% of the total investment or what comes out of the product that he's selling, the agricultural product. The rest of the 70% is lost because of inefficiency. Why is it that we're investing so much of our resources in India as the country into agriculture, but still losing so much in the process? Clearly there's some sort of inefficiency that's going on, and that's what most of the world has recognized. We're extremely inefficient as Indians in the way we go about doing things, but we end up trying to do everything at the same time. So I'm sure you know that that's one of the problems that we as Indians face in general in life. So in order to actually combat these problems, we need to recognize that there needs to be a balance. Because as I said before, if we were only to have a socialist economy, this wouldn't actually be the most effective thing, because it yielded the same results as having a completely liberalized economy. So the best thing to do is for us to find a balance between planning and allocating all of these resources, but also giving private investors and the private sector the incentive that they need to actually give back to the Indian economy and stimulate it for everybody else. So one huge problem in which we can see with the Indian economy is the highly restrictive nature of the labor laws. So if you look at China started liberalizing their economy in the 1980s, 1978 to be specific, which is just about 10 years before India started liberalizing their economy. And so naturally, most economists have determined that India, you can say, is about 10 years behind China when it comes to most indicators, most standards of living, and most things that show the health of the economy. We're 10 years behind. Now that makes sense given the fact that it took us 10 years longer to actually adopt those policies. But if you look at the amount of growth that China has had in that same amount of time, it's exponentially greater than any average growth that the Indians had in terms of the growth of our economy. So clearly there's something that the other country is doing that we're not able to do. And this has to do with the way we organize labor in India. India has one of the most complex and highly restrictive labor regulations and laws of any country in the whole world. So when a foreign investor is looking at manufacturing in India, for example, they're going to be discouraged because of how bureaucratic and how many red lines are attached to this process. They're going to be like, it's going to be far easier for me as an investor to put money into China and expect that money to come out than to put it into India. Because in India there's so much bureaucracy and there's so many problems and there's so many hoops that I have to jump through as an investor that it's very unlikely that I'm actually going to get the return that I deserve. So this is very clear. It's happened in our history several times, and it actually can be seen when you compare the manufacturing industry of India and China. China is the biggest manufacturer in the whole world. Whereas if you compare it to India, India is barely even able to compete with the manufacturing economy that China has. But then again, as Indians, we're very resourceful and we're very clever and intelligent people. So we were able to develop other sectors of the economy, such as IT. We're one of the leading countries in terms of IT development in that sector because we have the skills that are necessary to make us the most competitive country to be able to be very good at technology and information and all these other sorts of industries. But the problem with that industry and the problem with technology is that it can only feed a select few people in our country. It doesn't actually provide for the common welfare of everybody. And this is evident if you actually look at the economic history of our country. So after Narasimha Rao and after we started liberalizing our economy, the standard of living for people who are in the upper class and the middle class began to go up. But the standard of living for the people who are typically poor and who typically live in less developed areas actually went down. So all this shows is that the economic policies that we've started to put in place recently don't actually lift up everybody. We need to actually make it such that our economy is conducive to the interests of everyone. Otherwise, we're going to have a very disproportional economy with a very, very small amount of people who are extremely rich and a very, very large majority of poor people. So, as I was saying in regard to the information technology industry, this is an industry that only requires a certain amount of employment. So even though we have the most booming technology industry in the whole world, we still aren't able to account for all the unemployment in our country. In fact, most economists agree that the trend that they recognize in India is that the growth in the economy is not accompanied by a growth in employment. It just shows that the economy itself is expanding. But in fact, when you look at the facts, it doesn't actually show that there's more jobs being created. In the next decade, we're going to add 80 million jobs to the job market in India. But if we're going to be dependent on very small markets like information technology, then clearly we're not going to have enough jobs to make it such that everybody in India who's at a working level age will actually have a job. And that's a huge problem because in order to actually be a competitive country economically, the workforce, and especially the youngest and most capable people, need to have jobs. If they're not going to have jobs because of a very restrictive sector such as information technology, then we're not going to be a powerful country in South Asia. We're going to lag behind as we already are. So, going back to what I said earlier, if we were to remove all of the complex restrictions and regulations that we have in our country, then we're going to be able to allow more people to have access into the job market. And when more people have access into the job market, that means more people have jobs. But not only that, when you remove these sorts of restrictions, people from foreign bankers and foreign investment analysts are going to see your country as a greater opportunity for them to put their money into, which therefore stimulates your economy and increases your credit with other investors and people you potentially have to borrow money from. So that would just put India on a higher stage. And clearly, the reason why China is winning right now is because they've been able to do all of those things. They deregulated manufacturing, made the labor cost for manufacturing very cheap, so it's the best place for other countries to come in and buy their manufacturing goods. Whereas for us, because of the complex and bureaucratic nature of our system, it's more expensive to buy from India, so no one is actually going to buy from India. So next, this leads us into this idea of regulation. You can go to the next slide. Yeah, that's fine. So this idea of regulation, right? Before, when we had a socialist and planned economy, everything was completely regulated, obviously. That's the way the economy worked. It was literally planned by the government, where we were going to invest every single rupee and every single paisa would go, that was already predetermined by the government. Well, the same thing sort of exists now when you look at the agricultural system, because we still give huge subsidies to agriculture. Because as I said, India is one of the greatest agricultural producers in the world. It's the second largest producer of agricultural goods. So we invest a lot of money as a government when we subsidize into agriculture. But when you actually look at agriculture, are we doing it sustainably? Are we doing it in an effective way? And the answer recently would have to be no. Because we put so much money into agriculture, but the problem is we don't actually do it in a way that's effective. So the Indian government can put a ton of money into the agriculture sector and give this lump sum to all of these farmers and these agribusiness agro corporations, these large farming corporations. But if there's no efficient way to actually have irrigation, which is a huge problem that we face in India, then that's not going to be sustainable for that agriculture. So you can give a ton of money to agriculture, but if there's no way to actually transport the water efficiently so you can make the greatest yield or have the greatest productivity, then it's going to be useless. But if you look at what we are doing in India, we're just shooting ourselves in the foot. So for example, if irrigation is inefficient, farmers, what they're going to do is they're going to tap into the aquifers, which are the underground water sources. And they're going to deplete that. As they're depleting that, the water table underground is getting lower and lower each year, just demonstrating how unsustainable the practices are in India. So we might be the second largest agricultural producer in the whole world, but if we're barely even able to do that productively or efficiently, as I said, when only 23% of the pay is actually going back into the farmer's pocket because of inefficiency, then clearly there's a problem. So what I want to do today, I've only given you a few examples, but I want to start a dialogue with you, amongst yourselves and with me and with the new leadership, for you to begin to understand how can we start reaching out and taking these opportunities that we've missed in the past. Because India, if you want to be completely honest, and sometimes this is a bit shameful for us to think as Indians, but we started out on the same level as many other South Asian countries who have currently exceeded us, who are beyond any economic capacity that we've been able to be at on any level, in regard to economic growth, in regard to all of these other indicators of the health of our country. We're lagging behind. Literally, if you look at malnutrition in India, we're doing much worse than even some sub-Saharan countries. We might have all this great economic growth, and we might have these great numbers, and we might have very developed cities, but if we have 46% malnutrition of the people who are, who require the most basic needs in our country, who are our children, then clearly there's something that is off balance. So what we need to determine now is how to rebalance the Indian economy, which is basically the entire theme of my speech. So if you look at some of these problems that I went over, we've had to do with slow growth of the agriculture sector because we've been extremely unproductive in the way we reformed agricultural laws. We're not actually investing money in the right places, we're just throwing money at the problem. So we're bandaging the wound while not actually curing the disease. Next, you can look at the highly restrictive and complex labor laws. So this is a problem that's been cited numerous times as to why we never were able to compete with China. Because we had too much bureaucracy and too much red tape in regard to the laws and the regulations required for entrepreneurs to set up businesses. So once we made it hard for those people to set up businesses, then they're less likely to invest in our country and it's less likely to make us more prosperous. So looking forward, what we need to do, especially with this new administration, is consider how we can make India a more business-friendly place. Next is the issue of high inflation. So I know, especially the first generation Indians are very, very familiar with counterfeit money in India. Yes. Well, the problem with counterfeit money, and just the currency in general in India, is that when you have such a high amount of quantity of currency, there's already inflation in India, that's a problem. But the unaccounted inflation through counterfeiting and all these other sorts of problems make it such that the monetary system is in shambles. We barely understand how much money is actually circulating in our economy, how much of that is legitimate money, and so once we barely understand that, if an investor is going to come in and they see all these problems with our own money system, why in the world are they going to have any trust in the rupee? They won't. Clearly, in a lot of these issues, as I said in the first, we started at a disadvantage. We're a post-colonial country. We had to deal with the burden of having the British and the Muslims oppressing us before. But a lot of the problems we have now are simply due to ignorance or a lack of activeness on the part of the people to understand what the problems are and how to solve them. So the next problem, and perhaps the biggest and most pervasive problem, is the corruption in the Indian system. So you can enact all of these policies, right, in order to try and better the system. But if the politicians themselves are going to use those policies to benefit themselves and their friends, and not the rest of the society, then clearly there's a problem. A good example of this, for example, is agriculture. So many Indians are farmers and work in what would be considered the agriculture business. So what Indian politicians do in order to woo the electorate is they tell them, we're going to increase the subsidy for farms this year, or they don't even tell them they're going to increase it. They're just going to say, we're going to have a farm subsidy next year. Now, your average ignorant farmer isn't going to know any better than that there was already a farm subsidy last year, and that the fact that they're increasing the farm subsidy next year isn't going to do anything for that person, because the farm subsidy goes toward these agricultural businesses and these huge corporations. But once they basically entrusted the voter to believe that their farm is going to receive more money, then they've already bought that vote from that person. So the politician doesn't need to be any more accountable. All they need to say is that they're going to put a certain amount of money or a certain amount of trust in one sector of the economy, as they've done with farming, and say that they're going to, support those people in the society, but they use that as their tactic to get into office and never actually do anything afterwards. If you look at the reform laws in the history of India, in regards to what we've changed about labor, politicians are unwilling to actually change the regulations that we have in regards to labor and farming and all these other sorts of things because they're scared they're going to lose votes. They're scared that if they touch the regulations about agriculture, they're scared that that could mean 1 million votes next year or 100,000 votes next year. Now, clearly this is a problem because when they're weighing their own personal interests against the interests of the rest of society, then they have no business being a civil servant or a politician. If they're willing to put their interests before the interests of the rest of society, then you shouldn't vote this person in the first place. So that's another problem that I'd like to consider today. Is this idea of how we perceive politicians or how we view the people who are in power. Now, as Indians, we're very sympathetic people. We're very sentimental people at the same time. And it's somewhat unfortunate that we have a unique way of viewing our politicians that somehow detaches them from all of their worth or their job as a politician itself. So for example, when Rajiv Gandhi was elected in the 1980s, he won overwhelmingly. But before that, there was not much name recognition other than the fact that he was the son of Indira Gandhi. But at that point, there was so much sympathy for this person, at the point where his mother was assassinated the year before, that he won an overwhelming amount of votes from the Indian people. Which shows that we as a people ourselves have a problem with our perspective. We're willing to put our sentimentality before what we can actually consider to be real. So, in real life, the fact that Rajiv Gandhi's mother-dad isn't going to make him any better of a politician. But at the same time, it shows that our values lie in the wrong place. It shows that we value that sympathy towards someone who's a politician more than anything else. So today I hear all these things about Narendra Modi, and as a second-generation Indian, I can't tell you I know much about him. I can't tell you I know much about how good of a politician he would be because I don't understand the context as well as all of you do. But one thing I see is this adoration and this love for this political figure, and that's not wrong. But at the same time, you should never let ideology cloud reality. So Narendra Modi is a fresh face, and he's a new administration, and he's a chance for us as Indians to look back and reach the opportunities that we've missed in the past. But we should never try to conflate his potential to do that as a new politician as actual worth. He still hasn't demonstrated himself to us. He has said a lot of things on the campaign trail that are extremely valuable. But until he actually shows that he has enacted some sort of meaningful change, then until that moment we shouldn't trust him as a politician because we have a problem as Indians with trusting people who are politicians. We trust them before we do anything else. We trust them before we would even see the possibility of us having food on the table the next day. We just have a tendency to do that as people. Now, in order to recognize the importance of today, we have to realize sort of our position as non-resident Indians. We're in a very unique position to look at India and see and observe the problems because we can see it from a more elevated position. We're not right then and there, and we're not struggling on a day-to-day basis. We're the people who have the resources and the privileges and the knowledge to, in fact, move to a different country and make something completely new of ourselves. So clearly, there is some amount of resources that we have that we can use to give back to the Indian community to make sure that the important reforms are actually being put in place. The NRI presence really actually should be felt in Parliament in all regards, because we are typically the most educated and the most understanding people actually of how the political system even works, compared to the average people who live in India who haven't attained the same level of education. So for us not to use that resource and that influence would in fact be a tragedy. Because at that point, we're not recognizing that we have the utmost capability to change what is actually going on in this country, in India. And we can actually use the gifts that we have as people who are far more affluent and far more privileged in a different country to actually change the lives of those who weren't able to have the same resources as us, who come from our home country. So, just some parting words that I'd like to urge you to consider is that as we've went over today, I've only given you a few specific examples of where the problems in India's bureaucracy and the government have lied. And this can be transferred and applied to a lot of different issues. Many different things have happened. But it's the same pattern. There's the same pattern of corruption and inefficiency and a lack of understanding on the part of the voters. People are too willing to let themselves fall at the feet of politicians. Politicians use this for their own advantage, and no meaningful change ever actually gets enacted. So us as NRIs and people who are from a different position, who can view things differently, we have now an obligation to change that, given the unique advantage that we have as people with more resources. Thank you so much, and if you have any questions, please let me know.
Hello.
Namaste everyone, and today I'll be talking about the contributions of ancient India. First, I would like to talk about the philosophy of ancient India. The world in the Hinduism perspective was created by nothing. Everything originated from nothing. There was a small spark known as Brahma. Notice how this is similar to the Big Bang and the scientific theories. This sparked the Hinduism values, which are written in the Vedas today. The saints wrote these Vedas, and in them were the discoveries and inventions. The three main time periods of great ancient discoveries were the Indus Valley Civilization, the Vedic period, and the Golden Age. The Indus Valley Civilization is characterized by cities such as Harappa, trade with Mesopotamia, and traditional Hindu values. The Vedic period happened when the Vedas were written. Inside the Vedas were the discoveries and inventions which happened during that time period. Today, we refer to these books to find out how advanced the people were. The Golden Age is characterized by a lot of prosperity and happiness. India was among the greatest nations during that time period, and it was filled with exports and imports. It is clear that the greatest inventions and discoveries happened in India during that time period, especially in math, physics, and astronomy. In math, the Aryabhatta, a famous philosopher, created the number system which involved zero. Today, corporations and governments talk about millions and billions. This would not be possible without the number zero. In addition, he came up with a decimal system that we use today. This let us talk about in millions and billions. Madhava came up with pi accurately to 11 digits. Another ancient philosopher also calculated the number of years, the number of days in a year, and came up with 365.35 days. Today, with modern technology, this is only possible with an atomic meter. This shows how advanced we were in that time period. Even the fundamentals of calculus were written in the Rig Vedas 300 years before Newton. The contributions in physics involved the theory of relativity. An ancient philosopher explicitly stated the relationship between space, time, and the speed of light. Sage Kannada said in Sanskrit, translated into English, that matter particles interact with other particles due to their nature. This is the fundamental basis for quantum physics. These two discoveries were in ancient India long ago. In the 1900s, Albert Einstein came up with these two discoveries. Albert Einstein was also a main scientist during World War II to create the first atomic bomb. It is known that he referred to ancient scriptures in India and the Vedas to come up with such a bomb. Here is a list of all the theories and concepts and the Indian origin and the Western origin. For example, the velocity of light was written in the Rig Vedas during the Vedic period, and for the Western origin, it occurred in the 19th century. The theory of gravity was in 6000 BCE, during the same time period, and was discovered by Newton in the 15th century. In addition to all these, the Rig Veda also involved the elliptical orbits of the planets. Ancient philosophers and sages discovered the planetary motion without a telescope and only with the naked eye. They discovered how the planets were moving and the relationship between all the others. They also developed a calendar system that we use today, occurring with 365 days, 12 months, and 7-day weeks. Notice in this picture how Lord Vishnu is holding the earth. Notice how the earth is round. While the Western world was confused and debating whether the world is round or flat, our ancestors were convinced that the earth is round. While in ancient India during the Indus Valley civilization, many traders traded across the seas. To navigate, they used stars and other celestial bodies to find out where to go. For more information, here is a video representation and an audio visual to go with the contributions of ancient India. Mark Twain said, "India is the cradle of the human race, the birthplace of human speech, the mother of history, the grandmother of legend, and the greatest grandmother of tradition. Our most valuable and most constructive materials in the history of man are treasured in India only." Albert Einstein said, "We owe a lot to the Indians, who taught us how to count, without which no worthwhile scientific discovery could have been made." Hu Xi, a former ambassador of China to the USA, said India conquered and dominated China culturally for 20 centuries without ever having to send a single soldier across her border. Grant Duff, British historian of India, said many of the advances in the sciences that we consider today to have been made in Europe were in fact made in India centuries ago.
India, a country of extremes like no other, of a staggering diversity, where ethnicity, culture, religion and language come together in a dazzling kaleidoscope of humanity. In its 7,000-year-old history, India has provided the world with its riches. However, India's invaluable contributions to science and technology have all too often been overlooked. They've become so much a part of our daily life. We've taken them for granted. India's ancient knowledge